It started out with an idea to make a documentary.
Now, with over 60 interviews completed and more to record, it's time to listen fully.
These are the stories from those who experienced the Young Religious Unitarian Universalist program.
Hello and welcome to episode 6. My name is Lindsay Cattle-LaPointe. I ended up doing a solo trip to Washington, D.C., where I met a few folks for interviews. Sam Ames was one of them. We met in a strange hotel right by a busy highway. Sam was so trusting of me to be in this weird place with framed pictures of squirrels and small circular cushion that I had to sit on to listen to them. Enough said about the space. Let's now listen to the brilliancy of Sam Ames.
My name is Sam Ames. I grew up in YRUU in the Pacific Southwest District at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Studio City, and also Los Angeles. And I was in YRUU from about 2000 to 2004. We got the early aughts real taken care of. All of the fashion choices and the boy bands. I was born and raised in the UU Church of Studio City. Honestly, in part because they had a really great choir and my family was full of singers. But it meant that I grew up in a safe church and went to the rest of the world, and it was less. For someone who was queer, for someone who was trans, I had this very rare experience where I went to a private Christian school for 10 years. So my school was the unsafe place. My church was where I went for shelter. And as someone who grew up queer, like, no one gets that. I talk to people in my job now. There is just so much complexity around religion. There is so much trauma. And I'm like, I got so lucky. For the years that I was in a fairly conservative school, up until I hit YRUU, I had like one friend a year or so. And then if they left the school, I was just, and I like being alone, I was fine with that. But I hit junior high, and in the Pacific Southwest District, they have this incredible camp called the Beneville Pines. And so I got like a soft launch into YRUU. I was going to junior high camps there, where the counselors were 2 years older than us and in YRUU. And so I sort of got a YRUU light for a few years, and then my community largely became this funny little ragtag bunch of church kids who met once a month to sleep on a floor. That was my community, and it was such a strong one. And I went to school and I was so isolated, and I went there and I was a completely different person. And it got to the point where I just merged them. I just sort of like gathered some of the weird theater arts kids at the school I was in, and I was like, you know what? If you're in a theater, you're probably a little Unitarian. You're like Unitarian curious. And just wound up bringing them to a couple of cons until it became their community too. My school had a really strict dress code. For many years, I was in uniforms, and then very strict dress code. And I went to church on the weekends in t-shirts and jeans. I was told my like headmaster in high school told me that I would never get a job wearing jeans and Converse and weird political t-shirts. I did get a job, a couple. But when I went to church, people talk about dressing up for church. I got to be myself at church, and I had dorky YRUU shirts, but I also had Close the SOA shirts and Rage Against the Machine shirts, and to this day, I was looking for them. I think some of them have gone the way of the lost, but most of my wardrobe at some point was church kid stuff or stuff I'd gotten at a church conference. It was entirely politics. It was often from some weird booth at General Assembly. I I was going through an old box, and I have this old pair of baggy jeans with just like tears in them, rips everywhere. They're falling apart, and they are covered in Sharpie. I have a vague memory of this, of just like being at a con, it being 4 a.m, someone finding a rainbow pack of Sharpies, and just drawings, and it was like a cast, but for the bottom half of my body. And looking at these old jeans, I'm like, there's a rainbow here, there's some weird political chant here that we just learned from, I don't know, the social justice guest. It is this like sweet little yearbook that just happened to be on my body at one point. I know that Wink is now very controversial, but in my day, gather around, youngins. It was this sort of beautiful rite of passage, right? And that's complicated. Absolutely. Consent was important, and we were taking workshops on consent before going into this interesting space that is somewhere between wrestling and spin the bottle with a bunch of pacifist kids who also have a bunch of hormones. I still have rug burns from when I was like 8. I've been playing Wink for years by the time I got to YRUU, because we had this beautiful camp situation, because there was a district-wide community already that I had been a part of. But there is something so unique about it, and I met my first girlfriend, wound up being a Quaker, because obviously, and I offhandedly mentioned Wink one day, this like weird game I used to play with my friends, and she was like, wait, I know what that is. And early in the days of Wikipedia, I went, wait a second, and it turns out Unitarian Universalists and Quakers are the two that have Wink. It's not just YRUU, it is also young Quakers, and I think there is something beautiful about that, and also not accidental, that it's a bunch of pacifist teenagers who find this way to be consensual about violence, about bodily contact. I actually feel like for all that there is the capacity for real complexity with that game, I feel like I learned a lot about consent from Wink, right? Like, what the person in front of me says is okay for them goes, no matter what. Even if it means that I can't hold them back as well. At least in the community I grew up in, it felt like part of the lesson. We had this incredible, the late Craig Block. I hope someone else has mentioned Craig's name. Craig Block was this incredible advisor in the Pacific Southwest District. He was the first person I ever knew who had AIDS, and had been living with AIDS for years and years at that point. And every single con, every camp, everything we did, there was a workshop called Sex with Craig. And it was essentially a very, very truncated version of the OWL curriculum, where he taught us, how to stay safe, not just with sexual encounters, but with relationships, how to ensure that power dynamics weren't exploitative, and also how to keep ourselves safe from something that he had gone through, right? He was coming out of a plague, and he made sure with every single moment he had with these weird young people that we knew how to protect ourselves. I got sex ed at church, and I got sex ed largely from Craig Block, with a banana and a condom, that it happened at every single con. I couldn't get out of there without knowing how to protect myself against something that he lived with his entire life. And he died just a few years ago, and I cannot even count the number of youth who came through his care who now know how to protect themselves. Some of them went on to become sex educators, went on to take the Our Whole Lives curriculum and adapt it to teach to young kids, whether they're in the UU church or not. It is in fact quite adaptable. There is a great nonprofit in the Los Angeles area called More Than Sex Ed, led by Emma Linda McLean, among others. That is a bunch of kids who came through Craig's care who are now passing that wisdom along. There are so many stories like that that aren't unique to sex ed about these lessons that we learned, sometimes the hard way, that so many people who came through this weird community made it their mission to pass on, whether it was faith can be a safe space for you, or here is how to protect yourself against STDs. There's something really beautiful about the community that came out of there and how important it is, how important it feels for me to pass on the values, the lessons, and that feeling that it's so hard to describe unless you were there, but that it's hard to leave that community not wanting to take a little bit out into the world with you and share it. Sometimes the lessons of consent and bodily autonomy and sex as we were figuring them out, sometimes that didn't work out well. Often it did, and also we were exploring in this way that was kind of unique, right? You take a bunch of kids and you teach them leadership skills, and then you let them make mistakes on their own or not. And there are such beautiful things that come out of that. And also, the importance of a safety net becomes clear. And I think that's part of what ultimately led to YRUU not being sustainable as a model anymore, is that the safety net, it's funny, when I was 16, I would not have wanted to say I needed a safety net. And there feels like something disrespectful to my 16-year-old self. And also, right, we were entrusted to one another's care. And my 16-year-old self was pretty smart, in part because of this church. And also, sometimes an idiot, I'll be real. Sometimes I'm still an idiot. But that safety net didn't always exist in the ways that I think, particularly for youth of color, and particularly youth who came from home lives that were not always safe. It's difficult for a 16-year-old to know what to do with another 16-year-old without a safety net that says, you know, learn the lessons for yourself, but some things actually are off limits and it's not negotiable. So I think that some people probably did come out of YRUU with some trauma. I speak of it so lovingly because it held me, it saved me. And also, there are a lot of experiences of this thing. I feel like I really lucked out with my particular community. The Pacific Southwest District is kind of singular even in the YRUU experience. Some would call us codependent. I like to say we have maintained relationships for a very long time and that have strong foundations. But my generation of YRUU in the Pacific Southwest District has produced a whole lot of ministers. It's weirdly famous for this. Ministers, sex educators, religious professionals, a lot of lay leaders. And we still gather. The generation that I grew up with still gathers once a year. We created a young adult camp out of it, and then we all became old and realized that we had made a cutoff, not really thinking that 35 would ever come. And now we're having to figure out what to do next. And we're like, we had young adult camp. Is this now called old adult camp? We were very, very close, my little community and I feel so lucky that I got the Pacific Southwest District. Out of all the faith traditions in the world, I got Unitarian Universalism, and out of all of the age groups in the world, I got to grow up in YRUU. And out of all the YRUU districts in the world, I got to grow up in the Pacific Southwest District, which has a community that was so strong it has continued. Some of my best friends still are in that family. My best friend in the world I've known since I was 8 years old at that church camp, Rebecca Lee. When my partner and I started getting to the point, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years in, too late. When my partner and I started getting to the point where we were integrating into one another's lives, and when she wanted to meet my family, I brought her back to that community. And she came back as a guest to that community, and was very clear that this weekend was about meeting my family in a beautiful forest camp up in the Benneville Pines. But those are the people who know me better than anyone in the world, and I'm 36 years old. It's so funny watching people come into this community who have never experienced anything like it before. And the beautiful thing about a community that continues, like mine has, I'm very lucky to say, is that it keeps growing, right? It becomes not just the kids who grew up in YRUU, who are sort of like cousins to one another, but you keep bringing in new cousins. And so there are people in this community now who entered it as newcomers, which is a hard thing to do. It's hard to describe to anyone who wasn't there what it was like to have a bunch of teenagers with leadership skills, newly taught, learning how to govern themselves. Some of it is what you would expect. Some of it is worships where you spread junk food in one another's faces, and there is something genuinely deeply spiritual and beautiful about that. That is, if you were writing a caricature of what it would be if you let a 16-year-old run their lives, it would have some components of, junk food touch worship. It would. And those things have maintained and also become richer with time. There is this thing that happens, it certainly happened in my district, where my spiritual center, my spiritual life, is rooted in a kind of worship that I learned in YRUU, that kids came and found something that in whatever way spoke to them. And it was non-dogmatic, and it was flexible enough that it could work for a lot of people. And a lot of people, I feel like, found their spiritual core in a kind of worship that we didn't realize was unique at the time in our denomination. And so many stories are of YRU kids turning 18, aging out of YRU, starting to go to Sunday morning worship, and finding that it is spiritually empty. That's harsh, but not empty, but like damp. If we had been nourished and hydrated, we got to what our denomination as adults experienced as spiritual life and were heartbroken. And there was nothing to turn back to because there is an age limit for a reason, some of them legal, some of them ethical. And what was in front of us was so, it would have been almost gentler if it were just inadequate, but it was heartbreaking because there is now nowhere else that has this kind of depth that you have been raised to understand as God, or whatever God is shorthand for. It's just gone. It's like having your church taken away. And there are roots of it, right? We did in fact come out of this denomination. There are values that were given to us and that we ran with in ways that were creative and generative, in ways that the denomination as a whole, that Sunday morning services weren't always, but we did come from the same roots. And I think it's the reason, certainly in my community, you see two things, and one is really heartbreaking. You see a lot of people turn 18, stay in the church for 1 or 2 years, and then leave. This other group of people all became ministers, all of them. And I have to think that's because they found something they wanted to share, that they found something they knew our faith could be. And once you know that that's what we can be, it's really hard to settle for what we are. There is a gift in that. There is a gift in knowing we can be better. And I have to believe that it's something that we are called to, especially in this really complicated moment for our faith. This moment where we are wrestling with issues that have always been present, issues of racism that go back to the walkout in General Assembly decades ago. We are, in many ways right now, I'm gonna go a little, I'm just gonna run with this. We're gonna see where we end up. There are those who I think would say right now that we are living in fairly apocalyptic times. I lived in Oakland for most of my life. I woke up a few years ago to an orange sky and was like, yeah, this feels an awful lot like the end. And I feel like our faith feels right now like there is something existential going on. Part of what I love about the word apocalypse is that it is Greek, and the original Greek does not mean an ending. It means an uncovering of what always was, a lancing of wounds, so that there can be a future. And there are a lot of really extraordinary people calling our faith to be better right now. And I am both amazed and not at all surprised at how many of them came from YRUU. And there is something deeply theological about that. It's not just that we were raised to be leaders. It's not just that we got protest slogans. It's that we had a spiritual core that when we lost it, we are now fighting for what we lost. And for a lot more than what we lost, right? YRUU was not always perfect. Not everyone was welcome there. I have to believe that what comes next, and I have faith that there will be something that is next. We'll take what we did, say, wow, y'all were idiots, and do something better, right? It is my greatest hope that I live long enough to see a new generation take this up and tell me I am old and problematic. I am gonna love that moment. It will mean that I have lived long enough, which is not guaranteed. It will mean I have lived long enough to see the legacy of YRUU realize itself, because it's not about this one moment in time, as beautiful as this was. It was about change. It was about flexibility. It was about radical openness to being told something is not right and being called to fix it. Part of the beautiful thing about YRUU was that we were given the opportunity to make simple things really complicated. And I think some of those things became chaos, and some of them became the kind of uncovering of what, right, we're raised to think that sex and gender and orientation are simple things. I think that it is one of many things that is less simple than it appears upon even the tiniest examination. When you are raised with the freedom to make things complicated and experiment with that complexity, I think it turns out nobody's simple. So yeah, a lot of kids who came through YRUU turned out to be queer. I hesitate to say that nobody's straight. I hesitate to say that. Some people genuinely are, and you know, we respect identity, and that's fine. But I do think that in some ways this is sort of a beautiful experiment with what happens when you give people the freedom to interrogate things that have always been experienced as dogmatic, one might say. We are a non-dogmatic faith tradition. I think that extended in many ways to identity. And it turns out, I think, when you give a bunch of kids the freedom to be in touch with the wisdom that I think all kids have that is trained out of them, when you give kids the freedom to explore who they are, interrogate who they are, make mistakes with who they are, move in and out of what feels right with who they are, what you get is a bunch of people who don't really feel like that thing is simple. And that was certainly true for sexual orientation, gender identity, all kinds of identity that came out of YRUU. They let us depart from simplicity, and it turned out there were really beautiful things in the air. When you take a bunch of kids and you give them the space to make things complex, sometimes they make your church complex too. Happens to the best of us. And I don't think you can contain that kind of freedom. It turns out when you give people freedom of identity, when you give people freedom of thought and belief, they get a taste for freedom. And they start fighting for freedom. There are places in our denomination and our faith tradition that do not live up to the values of our faith tradition. And freedom is complicated. Liberation is complicated. It is not a one-time deal, which is why, incidentally, our principles are supposed to be turning over regularly. They haven't done it in a long time. I encourage you to Google Article 2. The changes even right now that are happening make people uncomfortable. It makes them squirmy. Listen, when they changed the introductory, when they changed the opening song at my church that I grew up in, I was so mad. None of us are immune to this. Change of tradition is hard. It's one of the hardest kinds of change there is. And when you say queering the church, what I hear is fighting for the complexity that we were allowed, because we know that when you introduce liberation into the conversation, change is possible. Something worth fighting for materializes. So in that sense, yeah, we queered the denomination. Did we make it a lot gayer too? Yeah, but I think more importantly, I hope we made it more self-reflective, because there are things worth reflecting on. There are ways we have fallen short, and there are values we instill that are worth fighting for, even maybe especially in the ways where we fall short. I do not know how many cons and camps I was the dean of. I believe it was in the double digits. Particularly with my best friend from then to this day, we co-deaned many an event. I started out for sure in, I didn't even start out in YRUU leadership. I started out in junior high camp leadership. When you transitioned to senior high camp, they allowed you to become a counselor in training. And I think that was the first, essentially, leadership development I took. Shortly thereafter, followed by, I think, the first anti-racism training I took. I was 13 years old. I understood nothing. And also, I got to go through those growing pains really early, and I look back now, and the lessons that I take are still the ones I learned as a 13-year-old in that anti-racism training. There are ways that it has gotten bigger and more complicated, and also the roots of it I learned young. So yes, I was the dean of many a camp and conference. I was the spirituality development coordinator on our board. I later went into national leadership as General Assembly staff. I believe my first General Assembly role was the Youth Special Events Coordinator, along with Sam Title. We were co-staff members on that one. We co-ran the events together. Ultimately, there was something, they taught us leadership skills, right? They taught us how to occupy the big boss position. They taught us how to show up in named ways. But I think more importantly, they taught us how to co-create a community, that being in a big boss role, being in a leadership position, is not about power, it's about service. It is about being one out of 60 people who could hold that role, and having whatever the time, skill set, thick skin to do the thing because it's an act of service. I think probably the most important leadership position I ever held in YRUU was a member of the community. And I am very, very grateful that when I first got into YRUU, I was painfully shy. I was scared of my own shadow. I sat in those early camps and cons at a table and literally played solitaire in the corner. And I watched what was going on in this beautiful thing that was emerging, and I felt home there, even if I couldn't say it, even if I was terrified to approach the cool kids. There was something about it that still felt home, and I think I wasn't the only one like that. We frequently saw the same quiet, shy kid over and over show up of their own volition, even if they didn't talk to a single person. There, I think, were probably a couple of those early cons where, unless someone came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder and scared the hell out of me, I was perfectly safe and content sitting in the corner playing solitaire. And it took like a year or two, the first few years of YRUU, for me to come out of a life that wasn't always easy, and a world that wasn't always kind, to really start feeling safe enough there to come out of my shell. And when I did, like the second I had even a heartbeat of it, someone was like, "You're gonna be on con staff." And I was. I'd said yes. I was very scared of whoever that person was, and how cool they were. I've had a pretty storied career for 36 years old, and have been really lucky to be trusted with some pretty extraordinary responsibility. And in those positions of power, I think about positions of leadership, and the same skills that I learned as a 15-year-old on con staff at a leadership development conference that my district paid for me to go to. I can't think of a single skill I have now that I didn't learn then. Every single thing I do now is an outgrowth of what I learned in YRUU and from this incredible community. It's part of the reason that it feels so important in the community that I exist in to hold on to it. It's part of the reason I have never left this faith, is that there has to be a spiritual and ethical core to leadership, or it is about power. I was taught really, really early to question power, including when I'm in it. I would not be where I am today. I would not be the person I am or in the positions that I have been honored enough to serve in if it hadn't been for some very cool person coming up to me when I was 15 years old, scared and playing solitaire in a corner, telling me I was now on con staff. and that community keeps me ethical, keeps me very aware that the positions we hold, the opportunities we are given are not about us. They are about being a member of the community and serving that community in whatever ways our ragtag collection of time, skills allow. It's all service. I know that I, can walk into some rooms because I look, if you don't know me, like I could be a young Republican. Like, there are ways I can dress up in drag as very professional. And I can get in those rooms in part because of who I am, in part because of respectability, because of whiteness, because I speak a particular language of the overeducated. The fact that I can get in rooms that not everybody can get in is just one more skill. It's just one more thing in that collection of things that allows me to serve in a particular kind of way. And as long as I am serving and not occupying, I'm doing the thing I was taught to do by my church, which is question power, always, always, especially when it's yours.
We will return after this message. I've learned so much through making our documentary and now launching this podcast. I'm amazed by the dedication, time, and resources it takes to bring these powerful stories to life. We couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to help us keep sharing them with the world, please visit YRUU.org/donate. So again, it's YRUU.org/donate. Every contribution, big or small, truly makes a difference. Thank you for being part of this journey.
I think my first real protest memory was I was about 17 years old and with a collection of YRUU kids protesting the Iraq War outside the Academy Awards that year in Hollywood. And it was my very first experience with a kettle, my very first experience being really scared in a situation of resisting authority. We had done it in safe spaces so much. We were trained to resist with training wheels. My first real memory of being out in the streets in a situation that turned dangerous was also with YRUU kids. And so there was a safety to it in that we had each other, and also we were terrified. We were in a kettle for the first time in our lives. We didn't know what to call that. We didn't know what that was. We just knew that cops were screaming at us and there was blood on the ground. I will never forget that. And I kept going out. I kept going out and I kept learning more about organizing. And when Proposition 8 passed in California, it was not about marriage. It was about knowing that the people around you weren't as safe as you thought they were, had voted against your rights. And so I went out and did what I had been raised to do, which was start a ruckus. Got myself arrested a couple of times. And I think it was within a couple of weeks, I had applied to law school. And I found out that I got into law school on a 100-mile march from Sacramento to San Francisco, protesting the California Supreme Court upholding Proposition 8. And I took that as a call to service, that a fairly stark reminder that no matter how lawyerly you get, no matter how fancy you get, no matter how many letters you have after your name, you're the kid in the street. You are serving in the way that you can. You are putting your body where it is most useful. Your brain's just part of your body. My brain worked a certain way, and so I went to law school, and they try really hard to train you to think a certain way. And I am so lucky that I came from a strong enough foundation that allowed me to take the training that was helpful, learn how to act the part, learn what drag was appropriate, and I very accidentally made a career out of it. When I was in law school, I was lucky enough to go to law school in Washington, D.C., next to where the laws come from. And I kept protesting. I kept getting into scraps, very nonviolent scraps, because I am a Unitarian Universalist. But the way that the police treated us was not nonviolent. So I worked with the National Lawyers Guild a lot through law school. I still do. It has been a couple of years now of not being able to, because I kept going out with the National Lawyers Guild because I know that at the end of the day, I am just one more body. And I happen to have certain things in that body that are helpful, but I still go into the streets with the bright green National Lawyers Guild hat on and run to the front lines and know that my presence there as a white person, as a person with a law degree in bright neon, holds a kind of power that can keep people safe sometimes. I haven't been able to do it in a few years. I got a rib cracked by a police baton a few years ago. And I can't run as well anymore. And you know, we get old and our knees start hurting, and we find out that there are a million ways to support the work of justice. Some of them are less flashy, and those are probably the most important ones. Which is really how I sort of approached this funny career that I developed. I went into law. I went primarily into LGBTQ civil rights. I found this real niche working with youth, actually. The intersections of LGBT rights and mental health so often happen when we are young. And I started working with survivors of conversion therapy, who I realized at some point I was answering more phone calls at 3 a.m. from someone in crisis than I was writing briefs defending them. I realized, because I had grown up in YRUU, that I was dealing with a kind of religious trauma that I didn't fully understand. I was so lucky. And so I went back to school in part to understand it. I went back and got a theology degree, in part because there are a million ways we're called to ministry, and I sort of toyed for a minute with whether ordination was one of those ways. It turned out not, in part because of, it's expensive to become a minister. It's expensive. I don't know if anybody watching this has a minister, but they have student loans you would not believe. And in part because I remember I was in I was in school. I was back in grad school during the 2016 election. And it was my last year of grad school. And I can remember sitting at a bar off campus watching the election returns come in. And at some point, I had to leave. I rode my bike to actually a very Unitarian house where people were very sweetly singing and holding one another in this way that was very right for them. And I couldn't fathom singing in that moment. I went home and I woke up the next morning not just to the news that Donald Trump had been elected president, but to the news that overnight we had lost 10 trans kids to suicide. And I didn't know there for a minute if I could handle being in an almost literal castle on a hill, watching the world burn around me. I went to a divinity school that was almost literally a castle. It was very old New England. And I went into my professor, Matthew Potts, with paperwork in my bag to withdraw. And I was, I grew up in YRUU. I couldn't separate faith from politics, but it felt so much like the front lines were where bodies were needed right now. And I was like, thank you so much for being someone I respect. I am out. I have to go. There are people dying on those front lines. And he said, listen, the front line right now is going to be what it is. It already is what it is. There are lawyers on the front lines and they are fighting. There are people on the front lines in the streets and they are fighting. And that, that front line is going to fall at some point. And they are going to need a second front. Are you going to be ready when that happens? He said, are you going to be ready when that happens? And I stayed in school because I don't know how to do the work of justice without a spiritual foundation. But very clearly politics and justice were calling me to be in a different kind of service. So I was called out of being a chaplain in a psychiatric unit in San Francisco to be the executive director of Trans Lifeline, mental health and suicide prevention nonprofit for transgender people. And I remember I got the call from an old organizer friend of mine, and she said, we need you to come in and be the executive director of this organization. And I said, it is so sweet of you to think I am in any way qualified for that. In what world am I qualified for that? And she said, Sam, honestly, the only qualification that matters right now is someone says yes, and I think you're the only one who will. And I went, all right, well, I guess call doesn't get more literal than that. And I did not know what I was doing. I had no idea what I was doing. Funny story, your first job as a leader, you are making it up almost entirely. And it turned out the little bit I wasn't making up was what I learned in YRUU. And so I just held on to that hard. I held on to service. I held on to approach conflict with an equal commitment to justice and compassion. I held on to, you cannot fix something unless you confront it. I honestly held on to some of the things I had learned as a registrar because we needed to get in line with some laws and we were not in compliance all the time. And part of being in a leadership position is making sure people get paid and have health insurance. They are the least sexy parts and sometimes the most sexy parts. No, sometimes the most important parts, especially when it comes to trans people. We made sure that if you were working there full-time or part-time, you had health insurance because as a trans person, that is life. I made the commitment to there with the caveat that I would be an interim executive director. I don't think that right now, especially when the people facing the most violence are trans women of color, that someone who looks like me should probably be the permanent face of an organization fighting that. But the person who followed me, the person who I pulled in to be my deputy, poor thing, did not, I thought she knew, but did not realize that I was training her to be my replacement. She is a minister. In addition to being an incredible advocate and great leader, Elena Rosveta is a minister first. And there are times that communities are in such pain that it takes a minister. And I don't just mean an ordained minister, I mean someone called to bring justice into the world and to bring care into the world. And I left that. I was the executive director of Trans Lifeline full-time while I was also a full-time theology student I was coming to class in the morning with a suitcase, taking the train straight after down to New York or someplace where we were having a fundraiser. I needed to meet with a donor or a partner, staying overnight, taking the earliest flight back up, and bringing my suitcase into class the next morning. I do not recommend this way of doing either school or job. But I finished both at the same time. And a friend of mine, 2 weeks into my I am never doing anything again rest period, comes up to me at a fundraiser. She cornered me in the bathroom. She said, "I need you to run this organization for me." And I said, no, I have no interest in power. Also, that's a really hard job, and no one should want it. No one would want it if they knew what it really was. It's exhausting. And she, terribly, also comes from a faith background. She looked at me and she said, "Sam, this is the service your community is asking of you right now. Are you saying no?" You asshole. She knew exactly. She had an impish little grin on her face when she said it. So I did it again. I was an executive director again. I again said, this is an interim job. I actually really believe now in the value of interim leadership, not just because from an organizational standpoint, it can be so critical in so many ways. In Unitarian Universalists Association, we now call this developmental ministry. Somebody comes in for a few years, assesses the problems, fixes the problems in a way only somebody who is sort of pre-fired, as my partner likes to call it, is, and then leaves. But also, as an interim, it's very hard to start believing that being in a leadership role is about you. It is entirely about who comes next and making sure that they are successful and lifting up their leadership. So I ran a couple of organizations, is the short version of that. I ran some nonprofits, some LGBTQ nonprofits. I took a year off to write children's books because I was so tired. And it was awesome. I wrote a book about sharks. I wrote a book about civil rights heroes. I wrote some books that'll probably never see the light of day, but it was lovely, and it was a different way of bringing justice into the world. And it was, again, you focus on youth, you focus on kids, and trying to resist all the forces that are teaching the wisdom out of them that was encouraged in us in YRUU. I went from there. I was called in to work at the Trevor Project as their Director of Advocacy and Government Affairs. Trevor Project is another LGBTQ youth-focused nonprofit and suicide prevention hotline. And it is very difficult, in my experience, to do direct services without feeling such anger at the system that necessitated them. That policy is a natural offshoot of that. Politics, advocacy is a natural offshoot of doing any kind of direct services. And by the same token, being in politics can get so far from the streets. It can be so detached and distant. And there is something so important for me about maintaining a connection to the ground, to church, to a spiritual foundation, to roots, to, for me, my community. So I helped run their policy and government affairs team for about a year and a half, advocating in state houses for LGBTQ youth, which is particularly hard right now. Transgender youth in particular are under a kind of attack that in 15 years of doing this work I have never seen. Nothing even close, nothing even close. And it's not about them, is the horrible thing. It's about power. It's about that thing I was raised to mistrust and try to remember to mistrust. And the people caught in the crossfire are these kids who are in part able to say who they are because our generation was given the freedom to name some of it. There's a kind of responsibility there, right? When I was a kid, I didn't know the word transgender. I didn't know that there were other kids who felt like me. And I knew when I was 3, I was having dreams when I was 6 and 7. I knew, but I didn't know how to say it. And I grew up in this incredible community that was being taught words and was also making up some of our own, and figuring out exactly how to give the kids who came after us a world where they didn't have to make quite as much up. And now there are kids who have those words, those life-saving words, and because they have them, they are being attacked. And there is responsibility in that. There's a responsibility in bringing power into the world, and language is power in so many ways. So I spent a year and a half yelling at politicians about trans kids. I spent a year and a half yelling at politicians to be kind to trans kids, and also, what if everyone? And I was pulled out of that recently to work in the Biden administration with youth. I am the Chief of Staff in the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. I am one of very, very few trans people in the government. Working with youth right now, being in that kind of a position, holding the identities that I do, and not just the ones that make me an only, right? I am also able to get in that door because I am white, I can dress in government drag, I can speak the language of the overeducated, I understand the law. Even if I started learning it because I needed to break it safely, I understand it. There is enormous responsibility in that. I have these incredible elders, many of whom I met growing up in YRUU, who they'll take me aside and remind me that that what is on my shoulders and the shoulders of anybody doing this work right now is about so much more than us. Is not about us actually at all. It is about being a member of our community, co-creating that community, making it safer, and knowing that having brought some beautiful power into the world, we have responsibility for that power. I spent a year, I spent 9 months and was pulled out early, serving as a chaplain in a hospital in San Francisco. I was primarily assigned to the inpatient psychiatric unit. And in San Francisco, a lot of the people who end up in the inpatient psychiatric unit are queer youth, young people, also queer elders. The reason for that is that so many people come to a place like San Francisco seeking sanctuary from a world that does not understand still what it is to be queer. And what they find now is an economy that has no room for them, that is dominated by tech in a way that has just completely eliminated so much of the safe space that used to exist. If you can spend a year on a psychiatric unit and come out not white hot furious at poverty, at an economic system that allows people to be lost. The relationship between poverty and mental health was so inescapable there. And as somebody coming in as a representative of religion, which is not always a source of comfort for young queer people, I had a lot of responsibility and a lot of mistrust, and the mistrust was warranted. I got these 2 tattoos in part because my uniform every day was a button down, and I could have this, and they could see that I had tattoos. And tattoos are queer flagging. This is from a book called Proverbs of Ashes by Rebecca Parker and Rita Nakashima Brock. Used to run Star King, both incredible ministers, and either in or adjacent to the Unitarian Universalist denomination. It says, but still, it is better to know. And this one is from Angels in America, but still, bless me anyway. And together, they are kind of a theology of trauma. They are I genuinely believe, my faith teaches me that no one should have to find God in the worst moments of their life. That God I believe in, or whatever God is shorthand for, does not put people through pain intentionally as a path to them, as a prerequisite. That is not the kind of spirit I believe in. And the fact remains that some of us do find God in the worst moments of our life. Those two truths coexist, and I got to go into these kids really struggling, these young adults, and these elders really struggling, and say you don't have to believe in God. You don't have to trust religion. You don't have to trust me. But so you know, this isn't because you're being punished. This is because the world is broken. And that is not your fault. And if you find meaning in this moment, it's not because the thing you find meaning in wanted you to suffer. I am not here for atonement theology or salvation by cruelty. That's not the God I was raised to believe in. I didn't call it God at the time. I had these amazing kids on the psych unit. I had this one patient who was like, I don't like the word God. I was like, me neither, honestly. It's kind of a terrible word. It has a lot of really complicated associations. I use it as shorthand because it's shorthand for something that people have a kind of consensus about. But it does not matter what you call it. They said, can I just like call it the thing? Because like sometimes I go to the ocean and I just yell. And it feels like I'm yelling like to a thing, but I don't know what that thing is. And I was like, yeah, you can call it the thing. You can absolutely call it the thing. You can still believe whatever you need to believe, whatever feels right to you, and also sometimes be proven wrong. I was raised in a faith that was like, be proven wrong, stay committed to being proven wrong. And that absolutely includes God. So call it the thing and yell at it as much as you want. There is great tradition of yelling into the abyss and calling it God. It's how I experience God most of the time. So, in long way of saying, it opened a conversation about a kind of experience that could be liberatory. And the liberation was more important than the God. I also had this amazing experience where like I was the only person on the unit whose job it wasn't to argue with whether or not something was real. So if someone was hearing voices, if someone was seeing things, instead of saying, that is not real, we will fight that thing, which is, there is good reason to do that. I was in a different role, and so I got to say, what are they saying? Does it feel meaningful? Like, what if you were in conversation with it? What is it trying to tell you? Because it doesn't matter if it's real. I hate to go back to a complicated work of fiction, but I did grow up learning things about anti-fascism from Harry Potter. And there is this one beautiful scene in the very last book, one of the very, very last scenes, when Harry is in King's Cross Station, but a very dreamlike version of it. And Dumbledore is there, and Harry has the option to go on or to go back. And he decides to go back, and at the end he says, is any of this real or is it all in my head? And Dumbledore says, of course it's in your head. Why should that mean it isn't real? I am so lucky I got to grow up in a faith that allows me the freedom to say meaning comes from all kinds of sources. Sometimes those voices in our heads, literal or not, are absolutely brutal. And I never found something so bankrupt that I couldn't find some kind of spiritual meaning in it. There had been this massive wound caused by racism in our community the day before. And I was young, 17. And my job at this event had been to put on special events. And we had a whole coffee house or something planned for that night, dance or something. And I was not my best self that night. You know, I had invested a lot of like heart and work into planning this thing. And I was so lucky I had this safe space with this other person, my co-event coordinator, to be my not best self with. And we were not our best selves that night. And we also had been trained, right? We were talking about these things that we had been trained in that felt embattled with our heart in that moment. And we knew enough to stay away from the people that conversation could really hurt. This is why identity groups are so important, is that we're not always our best selves. And I look back on that night with shame and should, that my reaction to this massive wound in our community was, what about that thing I planned? And also, it feels so important to talk about that night, because like, this is not the story that matters about that night. Every white person I know has cringe nights that they look back on and go, oh, wow, I really got that wrong. And I'm so grateful that I got it wrong alongside somebody who was not being harmed by me getting it wrong. And I learned to do that, even as I was not my best self. I learned to keep that part of myself from causing further harm from anti-racism trainings I had gone through as a young person. And it's not that they make you perfect. It's not like I was perfect that night. But I have to hope that anti-oppression work is harm reduction. And I have to look back on that night. I'm supposed to look back on that night. Say, that was wrong. I got it wrong. And thankfully, I knew just enough to get it wrong in a way that didn't cause further harm. But if we don't have those moments that we can say we got wrong, we are not going to get better at this. That conflict was ultimately mediated and leaned into, and the brunt of it borne by young leaders of color, some of whom we have not gotten back since that GA. Is because that was a pivotal moment in my life. I look back on that moment a lot. I think about that moment a lot. There's this temptation in anti-racism, anti-oppression work to be the good white person from the white side of this. And I think that there are so many moments that happen in an anti-racism journey, and the journey does not end. And one of them is the moment that you let go of being the good white person, because that is not a thing that exists. Not to say that there are not white people who are good people, but to say that the role of the person who does it right, the person who who as a white person does anti-racism perfectly is such a construct of white supremacy. Like perfection is a construct, and by in any way thinking that we can become the good white person, the good white person is kind of immune from change. They don't progress past that because they achieved the thing that they were supposed to achieve. And they ridded themselves of the way that they were raised, of this thing that's in their blood. And that is not a responsible way to go about growth. A couple of years ago at General Assembly, Dr. Cornel West came to talk. I was very, very lucky years later to have him as a mentor. And what he said when he came to GA and addressed that crowd was, this is a lot of white people. And I hear you're having a conversation about racism and white supremacy, and that is a hard couple of words to say. And I just want to tell you right now, if I have white supremacy in my veins, you probably have it in yours too. I want to just get it out of the way that yes, you do, I do too. It's not a blame thing. It is a reality of being raised in this culture. All that to say, we are doing some conflict resolution right now in our faith tradition. Resolution might be the wrong word. We are working through some hard times in our faith tradition right now, and many of them have to do with a kind of racism that has been part of us since we were born as a denomination. We have roots in mainline Protestant values that are not always reflective of our aspirational values. We were raised in a culture that is not always reflective of our aspirational values. The ones that I was taught, the ones that I genuinely believe this denomination is rooted in and are worth fighting for. Part of the funny thing about bringing up J.K. Rowling, can't believe I'm going back to this. No, I'm going somewhere. There are artists, writers, thinkers who bring into the world something that communicates their values. And when they fail to live up to those values, it's not the values that failed. It's human beings that failed. We fail constantly to live up to these values. I think what I hold on to about YRUU, about Unitarian Universalism, is we have built up so much, and so much of it is harmful, and a lot of it is good, and a lot of it is outdated. And when we just sort of focus on these things, we get Robert's Rules of Order. we stop seeing the forest for the trees. And if we look at the values that all of that grew out of, there is something important there. There is something not only unchanging, but changeable, but necessarily changing. And that is why it feels important to, as much as I am annoyed, because I grew up memorizing the 7 principles. I know them so well. Like our Constitution, they were designed to change. They were written by people who said, we have not perfected this. We are becoming more perfect as time goes on. We're supposed to change this. Even if I get really, really grumpy when my home church changes the opening hymn, I have to remember that actually we were designed to be changing humans. We were designed to be a changing faith tradition, a changing country. And when we get set in ways that have not served us, that do not serve particular identifiable groups of us, it is time to change. We are non-dogmatic. Our theology is non-dogmatic. Our values should be as well. We are rooted in something. It does not mean we are not rooted in a theology. It means that the theology we are rooted in is one of change. Octavia Butler said, all we change changes us, God has changed. God is change. Which is to say that conflict resolution, the best conflict resolution I have seen happen in YRUU, in circles that grew out of YRUU, has been a willingness to be so uncomfortable, that willingness to sit in discomfort that is hard and painful and that we do not always do. It is easier to let the messages that we have been learning our entire lives, that knee-jerk defensiveness that we all have, it's easy to let that craft the narrative and walk away. But the choice to walk toward instead, to sit in a room in a circle with a bunch of people who are hurting for many different reasons, some of them going back years and years, some of them really not our best selves. The willingness to sit in that circle instead of whatever was planned for that night and hear hard things, hear unfair things. The moments that I have seen conflict work for progress, work for change in my life have often been in rooms with a bunch of kids who grew up in YRUU. And sometimes not, sometimes we fail hard. I have to believe that getting better requires an openness to discomfort. Growing pains are rough. Growing pains are rough. I remember, right, when we were teenagers and some of us started growing really, really tall, really, really fast. We know growing pains are rough. We are going through some growing pains in our denomination right now. The YRUU community has gone through some growing pains. My community has gone through some growing pains. And I have to believe that as long as we're going through growing pains, we're growing. And that if we can make them a little less painful for the people who are already in a lot of pain, maybe that means we're doing it a little better.
Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. I wanted to jump in here to tell you that we are having a con-inspired connective retreat November 20th to the 22nd on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. This is co-directed by myself and Reverend Jason Lydon, with our weekend musician Matt Meyer. Many of the people you will hear on this podcast plan to be in attendance and even help lead some of the activities. Our registration is now open with a special early bird price. When you head to our website, yruu.org, click on Connective Retreat. It's time to connect. See you there.
If part of the change from LRY to YRUU was the presence of adults, even the minimal presence that there was in YRUU, I think that that will probably be part of the progression to the next stage of whatever this is. Because when you give youth the freedom to make mistakes, beautiful things happen, growth happens. And also, sometimes when we fall in dangerous ways or ways that are gonna hurt someone. And a safety net is important. I'm not saying that means that, you know, we have adults making all of the decisions. I think that young people being given a space that they are the leaders in and they make the decisions about is revolutionary and beautiful and creates leaders. And also, I can remember at the end of my time in YRUU, some of that evolution was happening. We had a little bit more adult presence than we were used to. There were moments that they drew a line in the sand about something that we were not always happy about. And you know, part of the thing about raising a bunch of organizers is they're going to organize at you. It's a beautiful and true thing. And you know, there are some decisions that we should not have been making. Some of the decisions were fine. Sometimes we decided that sometimes they make mistakes that they need to learn from. That's part of the beauty of this kind of hands-on leadership model. Sometimes they forget to include vegetarian options, right? In in the shopping trip before a con. That is a mistake as a leader that you learn from. That is not a life and death mistake. Somebody might be very angry at you, and you might have to have somebody do some driving to the grocery store to get some more food and then deal with the fallout of what that means for your con budget. But that's a mistake that you make as a young leader, given a safe space to make it in, and you learn from. There are other mistakes where the stakes are much higher. The consequences are much worse. So if a beloved advisor has been accused of sexual misconduct, it does not matter how beloved they are by a youth community. That advisor at the very least needs to step back in order to be accountable, whether they did something or not. Trust is broken, and harm can result. There has to be a safety net that says that person does not get to come back, and it does not matter what this community votes. That person does not get to come back. That's the kind of thing that none of happened in LRY. Some of happened in YRUU, but not enough. There actually is room for safe, youth-led programming in a container where mistakes are possible and generative because there is safety. And in order to make that container, sometimes there actually does need to be a hard no. And that's about consent, that's about oppression, that's about 100 things. And we talk about decisions as we make them, but also if we are going to continue being able to provide youth programming and creating these containers for youth to make leadership mistakes and learn how to be leaders from them and govern themselves in responsible and irresponsible ways. We have to do it ethically and we have to do it legally, because what has happened the last 2 times is the existential threat to YRUU, to youth programming and Unitarian Universalism, is the existential threat is ethics that aren't just meaningless ones that are imposed on a community, right? There are ethical mores there are moral mores that are, don't kiss girls. Those are not existential threats, but someone gets pregnant at a con, that is an existential threat to youth programming, to being able to trust that these spaces are safe, that we as a denomination can govern ourselves without the interjection of the law. I don't want police anywhere near the young people in my care, pretty much ever. And if I am an adult in that situation and I am not intervening in ways that prevent the police from ever getting involved, I am not creating a sustainable community. So yeah, we need some adults. I can even say when I was 16 and adults started becoming a little bit more present, not even numerically, just in the willingness to say no sometimes. I resented it so much. And I think if they had been doing that from the start, if I were used to an outer limit that was farther out than any other community any teenager gets to be a part of, but still there being limits, it would have been safer for me to explore leadership skills to begin with. It would have been safer to explore identity. It would have been safer to explore relationships. The container has to exist. It cannot be relationship anarchy all the time. The container does, in fact, have to exist, not just to keep individuals safe, but to keep the capacity of the community to exist safe. And I am really invested in bringing back a kind of community that I was lucky enough to be raised in a way where it is safe, where it is sustainable, and gets it better than the last two. LRY got a lot of things right. It got so many wrong. YRUU got a lot of things right. It got some wrong. I have hope that the next iteration of this, and that there will be, because it comes from something in the hearts of the youth in our denomination that needs to be together. I have to hope that the next iteration of this is going to do it better than we did. And I really hope that they last forever. I hope that they sustain for a long, long time, because it's hard to describe this to somebody who didn't grow up in it. And I also cannot imagine my life without it. It was my everything. It was my entire life. I went to school sometimes also, but this was my family. And I know that there are kids out there now who need family as much as I did. And, you know, this world is cruel, and most kids don't get that ever. But for some thousand of us, we did. And I hope that we can pay it forward by taking the lessons we did learn and helping create a container that is safer than ours was. And that still has all the beautiful mistakes, that choice to give teenagers the steering wheel in an empty parking lot. There is something so radical about taking a bunch of young people who the world says doesn't know anything and saying, actually, you have a knowing that no one else does, and it has value. And when you try to govern yourselves, beautiful things can come out of it, ideas that no one else would have had, skills that will last your entire lives. That matters. That is revolutionary. You raise a generation of revolutionaries. And I want that for the next generation. I want that for this world, because the kids who I grew up with in this incredible movement, they have changed the world. They have changed our denomination. They have changed government. They've changed the way that we see life as a global community. They're artists, they're ministers, they're advocates, they're really good parents. At the end of the day, it matters most that we were community members to one another, and the advocacy and the art and the spirit, it all grew out of that. And if we are not finding a way to give that to a new generation, we're not just doing a disservice to them, we are doing a disservice to the world that they change. So I think we're going to find it. I really hope we're going to find it. They deserve it. There was this moment, I honestly don't remember if it was singing or silence. 50-50 shot it was one or the other, but it was definitely one or the other. And we're holding hands in a room, and I have this visceral memory of feeling like my breath was connected to the breath of every single person around me. And that principle that I had been taught to rattle off, the interdependent web of all existence, interconnectedness, we are all connected. That thing wasn't just words. We actually do have a theology. I remember being so sort of transcendent and out of my body, and also so grounded to this community, to this incredible group of people around me. And I was an introvert. It is not that I love hanging out in groups of people, but it was so profound for me that I wound up going and making this sculpture project out of it. Where just like it is someone with their eyes to the sky and their mouth open, taking in breath that is the breath of everyone around them, something that has taken on such new nuance during a pandemic when we are disconnected from one another, from one another's breath. For a really shy kid and an introvert, the fact that I craved that kind of connection was transformative, probably. It probably is the reason I can talk to people in the way that I do today. I have never felt as connected to other human beings as I did holding hands in a really cramped coffee house with a bunch of teenagers who had not showered. That breath was stanky. And also it was life. Disbanded Pines has been so central to the lives of so many people in ways that you cannot, it turns out, describe fully in words. You tell people that there is this summer camp that is part of your life and has been for your whole life, and that it is the earth you call home. It is your spiritual foundation. It is the thing that when you open the door and breathe the air, it feels like your air. It feels like it gets into parts of your lungs that haven't been touched since the last time you were there. I know people who say Disbanded Pines saved their life. A not small number of people. There was something beautiful about it in the same way that cons are beautiful, where it's a bunch of ragtag kids coming together and being smelly together and wrestling around on the floor, getting rug burns and finding spirit, and having some guy from PETA come and give you a lecture that you will later realize had some real racism problems. I don't know if everybody has this experience at Ferry Beach or at any of our other conference locations. I have been to many of our other conference locations, and there is bias in me for sure, but there has always felt like something singular about Disbanded Pines. People who go there feel very changed by it. It was the place that I went when I had no other place to go. And I was not the only one. There are a lot of members of the on-site staff there are there because they are running from something unsafe. I know somebody who worked there for 2 years after having escaped an abusive marriage and brought both her kids. And Disbanded gave them a home and a job and anonymity and protected them. I spent summers there just working because they gave me free room and board if I worked. It was the only place I wanted to be, and it was the safest place that I knew. I think it's the safest I have ever felt. It is. There's a reason that my community keeps going back there, that we're still trying to figure out a way to keep going back now that we're old adults. Disbanded was a week-long con twice a year, is what Disbanded actually was. Literally speaking, Disbanded Pines hosted 2 camps a year that were extended cons. And if you take all the intensity of a 3-day con and like double or triple it, the intensity does not spread thinner. It just gets more. Relationships, marriages were made there. Marriages that are now welcoming their second child into the world. So many people who grew up there wound up in relationships, marrying one another, best friends, family, godparents. We really were kind of more like cousins than friends. These were the most consistent thing. Disbanded Pines was the most consistent thing about my childhood. I started going when I was 9. And it, It was take everything about a con, put it in the dark woods, and don't give it any curfew. I could try to describe it, but the truth is there is just magic in these trees, and the descendants of the the Manker seals, they still go. The descendants of the guy who founded it still are connected to this place and have shared it with this incredible group of people who are connected to this place in ways that it is hard to describe. But yes, the Benneville Pines is a camp and conference center that hosts many a Unitarian Universalist event, and also has been absolutely devastated by the pandemic, and is facing real existential threats, and very much needs people to go discover the magic that is there. It is absolutely exquisite forest. Spread out are a bunch of cabins in varying states of update. But all their plumbing works. And it turns out that is most of what you need. I literally miss camp food when I'm not there. Like, I get there again and it's not good food, but it tastes unlike any other thing. The air there tastes different. The water comes directly from a water tank that saved quite a few people when the fires went through there a few years ago. It is always under threat of fire. It is constantly trying to do things to protect itself and the properties around it. They do a lot of work that benefits a lot more than this one camp community. Honestly, as I'm trying to describe it, I'm realizing that there does feel like something distinct and special about it, and I think that probably if you have asked other people who went to the Benneville Pines, they get a kind of glint in their eye. There is something magic about it that it turns out I cannot put into words. And I'm pretty good at words. It's I don't know if it feels logical to say that land feels like family. But it does.
This podcast was produced by Linden Tree Productions. The interview was conducted by Lindsay Cattle-LaPointe.
Music featured by Scott Murphy and Matt Meyer.
For more information, go to YRUU.org. That's the question all spelled out, YRUU.org.
Don't forget our documentary, YRUU, is available to watch now by renting or buying it through Vimeo.
Please subscribe and review this podcast. It will really help more folks find this content.